The winter of 1884 had been the harshest in Rocky Mountain memory, claiming lives and breaking spirits throughout the Colorado Territory. But as spring finally began to melt the deadly snows, it would bring more than just warmer weather to the isolated cabin where Daniel Bear McKinnon struggled to raise 3 daughters alone in the wilderness that had already taken so much from him. Bear had built his reputation as one of the territory's most skilled trappers and guides, a man who could survive for months in conditions that would kill lesser men within days. At 34, his massive frame and weathered face bore the scars of countless encounters with wild animals, harsh weather, and the unforgiving demands of mountain life. But nothing had prepared him for the challenge of raising 3 young girls without their mother. His wife Sarah had died giving birth to their youngest daughter 2 years ago, leaving Bear with Emma, age 8, Lucy, age 6, and baby Grace, who had never known her mother's touch. The mountain man who could track a wounded bear through a blizzard found himself completely helpless when faced with braiding hair, mending tiny dresses, or explaining the mysteries of growing up female in a world that showed little mercy to women. The girls were growing wild, more like young wolves than proper young ladies, and Bear knew that his love alone wasn't enough to give them what they needed. They needed a mother's guidance, a woman's wisdom, a gentle hand to balance his rough mountain ways. But finding a woman willing to live in isolation with a widowed trapper and his 3 children seemed as impossible as catching clouds in a fishing net. That's when fate brought Rebecca Walsh stumbling through his forest, half dead from exposure and carrying secrets that would change all their lives forever. Bear first spotted her tracks 2 miles from his cabin, the unsteady footprints of someone pushed beyond endurance, weaving through the trees with the desperate determination of prey fleeing a predator. He followed the trail with growing concern, recognizing the signs of someone who had been traveling for days without proper food or shelter. He found her collapsed beside a frozen stream, her thin dress torn and inadequate for mountain weather, her dark hair matted with snow and dried blood. She was unconscious, but still breathing, her lips blue with cold, and her hands showing the early signs of frostbite that could cost her fingers if not treated immediately. Bear didn't hesitate. He wrapped Rebecca in his bearskin coat and carried her back to his cabin, where his daughters watched with wide eyes as he worked to save the life of a complete stranger. For the next 3 days, he nursed her through fever and delirium, spooning broth between her cracked lips and keeping her warm with heated stones and thick furs. When Rebecca finally opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was little Grace sitting beside the bed, playing with a corn-husk doll and chattering to herself in the unconscious way of 2-year-olds. But the most shocking revelation came when Rebecca tried to speak. "Please don't send me back," she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with desperate fear. "I know I'm trespassing. I know I have no right to be here, but please, I can't go back to him." Bear looked down at this fragile woman who couldn't weigh more than 100 pounds soaking wet, seeing the fear in her brown eyes and the way she instinctively flinched when he moved too quickly. Someone had hurt her badly, and recently. "Nobody's sending you anywhere until you're strong enough to travel," Bear said gently. "Who are you running from?" Rebecca's story came out in fragments over the next several days, each piece revealing a tragedy that made Bear's protective instincts burn hotter than his cabin's fireplace. She had been married at 16 to a wealthy rancher named Thomas Walsh, a man 30 years her senior, who had wanted a young wife to bear him the sons that would carry on his legacy. For 5 years, Rebecca had endured Thomas's increasingly violent disappointment as pregnancy after pregnancy ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. The frontier doctors couldn't explain why her body seemed unable to carry children to term, but Thomas blamed her entirely, convinced that her defective nature was a personal affront to his manhood. "He said I was cursed," Rebecca explained, unconsciously placing her hand over her flat stomach. "Said God was punishing him for marrying damaged goods. The last time, when I lost the baby at 7 months, he beat me so badly I couldn't walk for a week." Bear's massive hands clenched into fists as he listened, but he kept his voice calm and steady. "How did you get away?" I ran during a blizzard, Rebecca said. I knew he'd follow me when the weather cleared, but I thought maybe the cold would kill me before he could drag me back. I've been walking for 8 days, living on pine bark and melted snow. I was ready to die rather than face another year of his rage. And that's when everything changed forever. 8-year-old Emma, who had been quietly listening from the cabin's loft, climbed down and walked directly to Rebecca's bedside. Without a word, she reached out and took the injured woman's hand in her small, work-roughened fingers. You don't have to be scared anymore, Emma said with the solemn wisdom of a child who had already lost too much. Papa doesn't let anybody hurt people in our house, and we need somebody to teach us girl things because Papa doesn't know how to braid hair or make it stay neat. Rebecca looked from Emma to 6-year-old Lucy, who nodded seriously, then to baby Grace, who would toddle over to lean against Rebecca's legs with the trusting affection of a child who instinctively recognized kindness. I can't give you children, Rebecca said quietly, her eyes filling with tears as she looked at Bear. I'm broken inside. I can't be the wife you need. Bear studied her face for a long moment, seeing not the damaged goods her husband had convinced her she was, but a woman whose capacity for love had been twisted into shame and self-doubt by a cruel man's disappointments. Maybe what I need, Bear said slowly, isn't someone to give me children. Maybe what I need is someone to help me raise the ones I already have. But you haven't seen the biggest surprise yet. Over the following weeks, as Rebecca recovered her strength and began to settle into the rhythm of mountain life, something beautiful began to bloom in the isolated cabin. The girls, starved for feminine guidance and nurturing, attached themselves to Rebecca with the fierce devotion of young creatures who had finally found what they'd been missing. Rebecca taught Emma how to cook simple meals and mend clothes with neat, even stitches. She showed Lucy how to weave wildflowers into crowns and told her stories of fairy tale princesses who were brave and clever rather than just beautiful. Most importantly, she gave baby Grace the kind of patient, gentle attention that helped the toddler learn to speak in complete sentences and develop the social skills she'd been missing without a mother's influence. In return, the girls gave Rebecca something she had never experienced in her marriage: unconditional acceptance and love that had nothing to do with her ability to produce male heirs. But it was Bear's reaction to seeing Rebecca with his daughters that revealed the depth of change happening in the cabin. The mountain man, who had never been comfortable expressing emotions, found himself watching Rebecca teach his girls with a mixture of gratitude and growing affection that went far beyond simple appreciation for her help. She brought a warmth and gentleness to his rough household that he hadn't realized was missing, creating a sense of family that felt more complete than anything he'd known since Sarah's death. More than that, Rebecca's presence allowed Bear to see his daughters in a new light. Under her guidance, Emma's natural leadership abilities emerged as she helped with household tasks and looked after her younger sisters. Lucy's imagination flourished as she created elaborate games and stories that entertained the whole family during long winter evenings. Even baby Grace began to show signs of the bright, curious personality that had been buried beneath the chaos of motherless life. "You're good with them," Bear said one evening as they sat together on the cabin's porch, watching the girls play in the yard while the sun set behind the mountains. Rebecca smiled, but there was sadness in her expression. "They make it easy. They don't expect me to be something I'm not." "What do you think you're supposed to be?" Bear asked gently. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap. "A real woman. Someone who can fulfill a man's need for sons and legacy. Someone whose body works the way it's supposed to." Bear turned to face her fully, his weathered features serious. "Rebecca, the most important thing a woman can do is love the children in her care, whether she bore them or not. My girls have blossomed under your attention in ways I never could have managed alone. If that's not being a real woman, I don't know what is." Wait, don't miss this crucial detail. The confrontation with Thomas Walsh came 6 weeks after Rebecca's arrival, when the last of the mountain snows had melted enough to allow travel through the high passes. Bear had been expecting it. A man like Walsh wouldn't simply let his property disappear without making some effort to reclaim it. Walsh arrived with 2 hired guns and an attitude of absolute entitlement, riding into Bear's yard like a man accustomed to taking whatever he wanted through intimidation and violence. He was a tall, thin man with cold eyes and a carefully groomed appearance that spoke of wealth and social position. "McKinnon!" Walsh called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who expected immediate compliance. "I know you're harboring my wife. Send her out, and we can settle this without unpleasantness." Bear stepped onto his porch, his massive frame filling the doorway as his daughters huddled behind him. Rebecca stood in the cabin's interior, visible through the open door, but protected by Bear's presence. "I don't see anybody here who belongs to you, Walsh," Bear replied calmly, his hand resting casually near his rifle. "I see a woman who asked for shelter and 3 children who need protecting." Walsh's face darkened with anger. "That woman is legally my wife. She has no right to abandon her duties and obligations. I'm prepared to overlook her disobedience if she comes home immediately." "And if she doesn't want to come home?" Bear asked. "What she wants is irrelevant," Walsh snapped. "She's my property, bought and paid for with a substantial bride price to her father. I have legal documents proving my ownership." That's when Rebecca stepped forward, moving to stand beside Bear, despite the obvious fear in her eyes. "I am not property, Thomas. I am a human being with the right to choose my own life." Walsh's expression grew ugly. "You are a defective woman who has failed in your primary purpose. The only reason I'm willing to take you back is because I paid good money for you. But if you continue this foolishness, I'll make sure the rest of your worthless life is spent regretting it." What you're seeing now is nothing compared to what happens next. Bear's response was swift and decisive. Before Walsh could react, the mountain man had crossed the yard in 3 long strides and lifted the smaller man off his horse by his throat, holding him at arm's length with the casual ease of someone handling a child. "Now you listen to me very carefully," Bear said, his voice calm but carrying the unmistakable promise of violence. "That woman has found sanctuary in my house, under my protection. My daughters love her and need her. She's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go." Walsh struggled uselessly against Bear's grip, his hired guns reaching for their weapons until they found themselves staring down the barrels of rifles held by Emma and Lucy, who had positioned themselves with the tactical awareness of children raised in dangerous country. "You can't threaten me," Walsh gasped. "I have legal rights. I have influence. I'll bring the territorial marshal—" "Bring whoever you want," Bear interrupted, "but they'll find a woman who chose to leave an abusive marriage and found refuge with a family that values her. They'll find 3 children who will testify that she's the best thing that ever happened to them, and they'll find me, ready to protect what's mine." Bear set Walsh back on his horse, with just enough force to make his point clear. "Ride away, Walsh. Don't come back, because next time I won't be so gentle about explaining that some things are more important than legal documents." As Walsh and his hired guns rode away, Rebecca collapsed against the cabin wall, her strength finally giving out after weeks of fear and uncertainty. But when Bear reached for her, she didn't flinch away. Instead, she let him hold her while she cried tears that seemed to wash away years of accumulated pain and shame. "It's over," Bear murmured against her hair. "You're safe now. You're home." And that's when the most incredible transformation began. The wedding took place 3 months later, performed by a traveling preacher who made his annual circuit through the mountain settlements. It wasn't a grand affair, just Bear and Rebecca, his 3 daughters serving as witnesses, and a handful of neighbors who had made the difficult journey to celebrate with them. But it was a ceremony filled with love, hope, and the radical promise that families could be built on choice rather than obligation, on mutual respect rather than ownership, on the desire to nurture and protect rather than dominate and control. Emma had woven wildflower crowns for herself and her sisters, while Lucy had picked a bouquet of mountain daisies for Rebecca to carry. Baby Grace, now speaking in full sentences and walking with confident steps, scattered pine needles instead of rose petals as she walked ahead of the bride. When the preacher asked if Bear would take Rebecca as his wife, to love and cherish regardless of whether she could provide him with sons, Bear's answer rang across the mountain valley with absolute conviction. I take her as my partner, my companion, and the mother of my heart if not my blood. I promise to honor her choices, protect her dreams, and stand beside her through whatever challenges life brings us. Rebecca's vows were equally powerful, promising to love not just Bear, but the daughters who had taught her that motherhood was about nurturing spirits rather than producing heirs, about creating love rather than fulfilling expectations. Years passed, and the McKinnon cabin became known throughout the territory as a place where damaged souls could find healing and lost families could be rebuilt. Rebecca never did carry a pregnancy to term, but she and Bear raised not only his 3 daughters, but also several orphaned children who found their way to the mountain sanctuary. Emma grew up to become a teacher, carrying her stepmother's gentleness and her father's strength into classrooms throughout the Colorado Territory. Lucy became an artist whose paintings captured the beauty of mountain life and the dignity of the people who chose to live beyond civilization's constraints. Grace became a doctor, inspired by Rebecca's knowledge of healing and Bear's belief that women could accomplish anything they set their minds to. The woman who had been told she was worthless because she couldn't bear sons became the mother who raised daughters proud and strong enough to change the world around them. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that family is built on love rather than biology, and that worth is measured by the capacity to nurture rather than the ability to produce heirs, then you've found your home. Subscribe to Wild West Romance Stories for more tales of healing, hope, and love that grows strongest when it's rooted in acceptance and mutual respect. From mountain sanctuaries to chosen families, every story we tell proves that the greatest strength comes from embracing those who need us most. This is where broken hearts learn to heal and where love creates families that biology never could. The ancient caves of Skeleton Canyon had witnessed more blood and betrayal than any place in the Arizona Territory, earning their reputation as a graveyard for the greedy and the foolish. But on this sweltering summer day in 1882, they were about to become the setting for an encounter that would challenge everything the frontier believed about loyalty, justice, and the thin line between right and wrong. Rides Far had been tracking the stolen army payroll for 6 days, following a trail of broken promises and dead soldiers through the most unforgiving terrain in Apache country. At 31, he was the most skilled tracker in Geronimo's band, a warrior whose ability to read sign and predict human behavior had saved countless Apache lives during the endless cat-and-mouse game with the cavalry. His reputation extended far beyond his own people. Even Army scouts spoke his name with grudging respect and barely concealed fear. The theft of $40,000 in Army gold had sent shockwaves through every military post from Fort Bowie to Fort Huachuca. 3 soldiers were dead, their bodies found stripped and mutilated in classic Apache fashion. Every tracker, bounty hunter, and cavalry patrol in the territory was searching for the war party responsible, promising swift and brutal justice for what appeared to be another savage attack on civilized society. But Rides Far knew something the white authorities didn't. No Apache had taken that gold. The trail he followed told a different story, one written in subtle signs that only an expert tracker could read. The hoof prints were shod horses, not the unshod ponies his people preferred. The killings had been done with Army-issue knives, not traditional Apache weapons. Most telling of all, the bodies had been positioned and mutilated by someone who wanted it to look like Apache work but didn't understand the spiritual significance behind Apache battle customs. This was the work of white men posing as Indians, and Rides Far intended to prove it. But the most shocking discovery was what he found hidden in the deepest cave of the canyon network. As Rides Far's horse picked its way carefully down the narrow trail that led to the cave entrance, a sound reached his ears that made him freeze in his saddle, the unmistakable sob of a woman in distress. His hand moved instinctively to his rifle as he scanned the rocky terrain for signs of ambush, but the crying continued, echoing off the canyon walls with a quality of genuine despair that couldn't be faked. He dismounted silently and approached the cave on foot, every sense alert for danger. The opening was partially concealed by fallen rocks and desert brush, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom inside, Ridesfar saw something that made his warrior's blood run cold. A young white woman sat, huddled against the far wall of the cave, her dress torn and stained with dust and dried blood. Her blonde hair hung in tangled ropes around a face that bore the bruises of recent violence, and her blue eyes were wide with terror and exhaustion. Scattered around her were canvas bags that had burst open, spilling gold coins across the stone floor like fallen stars. She looked up at his approach and screamed, pressing herself against the cave wall as if she could somehow disappear into the stone itself. But when Ridesfar raised his hand in the universal gesture of peace and spoke to her in careful English, her terror gave way to desperate hope. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying, "I know what you must think, but I'm not what I appear to be. I'm not one of them." Ridesfar studied her face, reading the truth written in her bruises and the genuine fear in her eyes. "Who are them?" he asked quietly. "The men who killed those soldiers," she replied, her voice growing stronger despite her obvious pain. "My husband and his partners. They dressed like Apache warriors, used Apache weapons they'd stolen from previous raids. They wanted everyone to believe Indians had taken the gold. The implications hit Ridesfar like a physical blow. This woman was married to one of the men responsible for the murders that had brought down the wrath of the entire U.S. Army on his people. Apache bands were already being hunted like animals based on evidence these criminals had deliberately fabricated. And that's when everything changed forever. "Why are you telling me this?" Ridesfar asked, his dark eyes never leaving her face as he searched for deception. "Why would you betray your own husband?" The woman, she looked barely 20 despite the hardships written on her features, laughed bitterly. "My own husband? Thomas Brennan bought me from my father when I was 15 years old, like I was a piece of livestock. He's beaten me, starved me, used me as bait for his confidence schemes across 3 territories. The only reason I'm still alive is because I'm useful to him." She gestured toward the scattered gold with a trembling hand. This was supposed to be their big score, enough money to disappear to Mexico and live like kings, but they started fighting over the split before they even got back to camp. Thomas killed his 2 partners in their sleep, then came after me when he realized I'd overheard him planning to eliminate all the witnesses. Ridesfar felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "You ran with the gold." "I ran for my life," she corrected. "The gold just happened to be what I grabbed when I heard him loading his gun. I thought if I could get it back to the army, if I could prove what really happened to those soldiers, maybe someone would finally believe the truth about what kind of man Thomas Brennan really is." The warrior studied her face for a long moment, seeing not just the obvious signs of abuse and terror, but something deeper. A steel core of determination that reminded him of Apache women who had survived captivity and fought their way back to freedom. "What's your name?" he asked. "Catherine," she replied. "Catherine Brennan, though I'd give anything to change it." "Catherine," Ridesfar repeated, testing the unfamiliar sounds on his tongue. "I am called Ridesfar. And you are right to run. Your husband and men like him have brought death to many innocent people. But you haven't seen the biggest surprise yet." As Ridesfar knelt beside Catherine to examine her injuries, she reached into the bodice of her torn dress and withdrew a small leather journal, its pages filled with careful handwriting. "It's all in here," she said urgently. "Every scheme, every crime, every innocent person they've murdered or framed over the past 3 years. Thomas kept records because he was proud of how clever he thought he was." Ridesfar opened the journal and began to read, his expression growing darker with each page. The entries detailed not just the recent Army payroll theft, but a pattern of crimes that stretched across the Southwest, wagon trains robbed and their passengers murdered, with the deaths blamed on Apache raids. Trading posts burned and looted, with Apache arrows left behind as false evidence. Even the massacre of a peaceful Apache family that had led to a cavalry assault on Ridesfar's own village was revealed to be the work of Brennan's gang. "How many of my people have died because of these lies?" Ridesfar asked, his voice carrying the weight of old grief and new rage. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "Too many. I tried to warn people when I could, but Thomas watched me like a hawk. Anytime I showed compassion or tried to help his victims, he'd beat me until I couldn't stand. He said it was my job to smile and keep my mouth shut while he built his fortune on other people's blood. The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls, cutting through their conversation like a knife. Rides Farr's head snapped up as he recognized the rhythm, multiple horses moving at a steady pace that suggested their riders were tracking rather than fleeing. "He's found us," Catherine whispered, her face going pale. "Thomas doesn't give up when money's involved. He'll kill us both rather than let that gold slip away." Rides Farr moved to the cave entrance and peered carefully around the rocks. 3 riders were working their way down the canyon, their eyes scanning every shadow and crevice. Even from a distance, he could see the military equipment they carried, army uniforms and weapons that would allow them to pose as soldiers if they encountered any real cavalry patrols. "Stay here," Rides Farr told Catherine, checking his rifle and the spare ammunition in his belt. "Keep the journal safe. If something happens to me, try to get it to the nearest army post." Catherine grabbed his arm as he started toward the cave entrance. "You don't have to fight them for me. I know what I am to you, just another white woman whose problems aren't your concern." Rides Farr looked down at her hand on his arm, then met her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You are a woman who has suffered injustice and fought back with courage. That makes you worthy of protection, regardless of the color of your skin." Wait, don't miss this crucial detail. The battle that followed was swift and brutal, fought among the towering rock formations and narrow passages that made Skeleton Canyon a natural fortress for those who knew how to use its terrain. Rides Farr's intimate knowledge of every ledge and shadow gave him the advantage, but Brennan's men were experienced killers who fought with the desperate cunning of cornered animals. The first man died silently, Rides Farr's arrow taking him through the throat before he could cry out a warning. The second managed to fire one shot that echoed off the canyon walls before a well-placed rifle bullet ended his threat permanently. But Thomas Brennan himself proved more dangerous than his hired guns, using Catherine as a human shield when Rides Farr finally cornered him near the cave entrance. "Come out, Apache!" Brennan shouted, his arm locked around Catherine's throat and his pistol pressed to her temple. "I know you're in there. This doesn't have to be your fight." "It became my fight when you decided to murder innocent soldiers and blame my people," Rides Farr called back, his rifle trained on the narrow gap between Brennan's head and Catherine's. "Your people are dying anyway," Brennan snarled. "The army's going to hunt you down like animals, whether I frame you for this job or not. At least this way, I get rich in the process." Catherine's eyes met Rides Farr's across the dusty space between them, and in that moment, she made a choice that would echo through both their lives. Instead of remaining passive, she suddenly threw her weight backward, driving her elbow into Brennan's ribs and breaking his grip just long enough for Rides Farr to take the shot. The bullet took Thomas Brennan between the eyes, ending his career in murder and deception with the finality of absolute justice. What you're seeing now is nothing compared to what happens next. As the echoes of gunfire faded and silence returned to Skeleton Canyon, Catherine collapsed against the cave wall, her strength finally giving out after days of terror and desperate flight. Rides Farr knelt beside her, checking for injuries with the careful expertise of a warrior who had tended many wounded comrades. "It's over," he said quietly. "You're safe now." Catherine looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude, exhaustion, and something deeper, a recognition that went beyond the circumstances of their meeting. "You saved my life, but more than that, you believed me when no one else would have." "Truth has its own voice," Rides Farr replied. "Those who listen with honest hearts can always hear it." Over the next several hours, as they gathered the scattered gold and prepared for the journey back to civilization, Catherine told him more of her story. She had been sold into marriage by a father, drowning in gambling debts, trapped in a life of violence and crime with no means of escape. Her education, unusual for a frontier woman, had come from a schoolteacher mother who had died when Catherine was 12, leaving her with knowledge but no power to use it. I can read and write in 3 languages, she said with bitter irony. I know history, literature, mathematics, but none of that mattered as long as I was considered property instead of a person. Rides. Farr listened without judgment, recognizing in her words the same frustration he had felt watching his own people's knowledge and traditions dismissed as worthless by those who claimed to represent civilization. When they finally reached the army post at Fort Bowie, Catherine's testimony and the evidence in Brennan's journal created a sensation that reached all the way to Washington. The false Apache raids were exposed, leading to the court-martial of several officers who had used the fabricated attacks to justify brutal campaigns against peaceful tribes. Rewards were offered for information about other criminals who might be using similar tactics. But the most significant change came in the form of an official apology and reparations for the Apache bands that had been wrongly attacked based on Brennan's manufactured evidence. And that's when the most incredible transformation began. Catherine Brennan, no longer bound by marriage to a dead criminal, found herself in the unique position of being both wealthy. She was awarded a substantial portion of the recovered gold as compensation for her role in exposing the truth, and free to choose her own future for the first time in her adult life. She chose to stay in Apache country. Using her newfound resources, Catherine established a trading post at the crossroads between Apache territory and the white settlements, a place where members of both cultures could meet peacefully to exchange goods and information. But more than just a business, it became a bridge between worlds, a place where Apache children could learn English and arithmetic, where white settlers could gain honest knowledge about their native neighbors instead of relying on fear and prejudice. Rides Farr became her partner in this endeavor, his reputation among his people and his growing fluency in English making him an ideal intermediary. Together, they created something unprecedented, a business relationship based on mutual respect and shared goals that gradually evolved into something deeper and more personal. Months passed before either of them acknowledged what was growing between them. The attraction was obvious to everyone who saw them together, but both carried the scars of past traumas that made trust difficult and love seem like a luxury they couldn't afford. It was Catherine who finally spoke the words that had been building between them, like pressure behind a dam. I know this is impossible, she said one evening as they sat together, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. I know there are a dozen reasons why we could never work, but I need you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my life. Rides Farr was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting the dying light. Why is it impossible? He asked finally. Because I'm white and you're Apache. Because your people will never fully accept me, and mine will call me a traitor. Because we come from different worlds that have been at war for generations. And yet here we are, Rides Farr said simply. 2 people who found truth in each other when lies surrounded us on all sides. 2 people who built something good together when everything around us was falling apart. If that isn't love, what is? Catherine turned to look at him, seeing not the fearsome Apache warrior of white nightmares, but the man who had saved her life, believed her story, and stood beside her as she built a new future from the ashes of her old one. I love you, she said, the words carrying the weight of absolute truth. Despite everything that should make it impossible, I love you. Rides Farr reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. Then we will make the impossible possible. We will show both our peoples that love is stronger than hatred, that understanding is more powerful than fear. The woman who had been sold as property had become a bridge between worlds, and the warrior who had spent his life fighting for his people's survival had found a new way to ensure their future. Through partnership, understanding, and the radical belief that love could triumph over the prejudices that divided their worlds. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that sometimes the greatest courage lies in choosing love over fear, truth over convenience, and hope over hatred, then you've found your home. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales of redemption, transformation, and love that defies every boundary society tries to build. From canyon hideouts to trading post partnerships, every story we tell proves that the strongest bonds are forged not in comfort, but in the crucible of shared struggle and mutual respect. This is where two worlds meet and discover that love speaks a language everyone can understand. The desert wind howled like the voices of ancient spirits across the vast New Mexico wasteland, carrying tales of death and abandonment on its scorching breath. But on this particular day, it would also carry whispers of an impossible rescue that would challenge everything the frontier believed about honor, mercy, and the bonds that can form between sworn enemies. Eagle Feather crested the rocky ridge at sunset, his paint horse moving with the fluid grace of a predator scanning for prey. The Apache warrior had been tracking a band of cattle rustlers for 3 days, following their trail deeper into the Chihuahuan Desert where few men dared to venture. At 27, he possessed the patience of a seasoned hunter and the deadly skills of a war chief's son, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to discover in the shadow of Devil's Backbone Mesa. The broken wagon appeared first, a splintered wreck of wood and iron scattered across the sand like the bones of some massive desert creature. Torn canvas fluttered in the wind like funeral shrouds, and the skeletal remains of 2 horses lay bleaching in the merciless sun. But it was the figure beside the wreckage that made Eagle Feather's blood run cold. A woman lay motionless in the sand, her once fine dress now tattered and stained with dust and dried blood. Her pale skin had been burned red by the desert sun, and her lips were cracked and swollen with thirst. But what struck the warrior most powerfully was the unmistakable curve of her belly. She was heavily pregnant, perhaps only weeks from giving birth. This was no ordinary abandoned traveler. This was a life hanging by the thinnest of threads, and within her another life that had never drawn its first breath. But the most shocking thing was what Eagle Feather discovered when he approached her still form. The woman's eyes fluttered open as his shadow fell across her face, revealing irises the color of winter sky. She tried to speak, but only a rasping whisper emerged from her parched throat. In her right hand, she clutched a small silver locket, and pinned to her torn bodice was a yellowed piece of paper, a notice offering a substantial reward for her safe return. Elizabeth Morrison, Eagle Feather read aloud, the English words feeling strange on his tongue. Wife of Colonel James Morrison, Fort Stanton, missing since September 10th, reward, $500 dead or alive. The irony wasn't lost on him. Colonel Morrison was the same military officer who had led the brutal campaign against Eagle Feather's own village 2 winters ago, the man responsible for the deaths of dozens of Apache women and children, the same man who had put a bounty on Eagle Feather's own head and sworn to see him hang from the gallows at Fort Stanton. And now Morrison's wife lay dying in the desert, carrying his unborn child. Eagle Feather knelt beside the woman, his warrior's training warring with something deeper, a code of honor his grandmother had instilled in him long before he learned to kill. Water, Elizabeth whispered, her hand moving protectively over her swollen belly. Please, the baby. The Apache warrior's dark eyes swept the horizon, calculating distances and dangers. Fort Stanton was 40 miles north through hostile territory. His own people's hidden camp lay 30 miles southwest, but bringing a white woman there would mean exposing his band to terrible risk. The desert offered no shelter, no mercy, no second chances for those who made the wrong choice. But as Elizabeth's eyes began to close again, as her breathing grew shallow and labored, Eagle Feather made a decision that would echo through both their lives like thunder across empty plains. And that's when everything changed forever. Without hesitation, Eagle Feather lifted Elizabeth in his powerful arms, marveling at how light she felt despite her pregnancy. Her head rolled against his shoulder as he carried her to his horse, and he could feel the rapid flutter of her pulse beneath skin that burned with fever. Every instinct screamed at him to leave her. She was the enemy's wife, a symbol of everything that had been taken from his people. But his grandmother's voice whispered in his memory, "A true warrior protects life, especially when that life cannot protect itself." He fashioned a makeshift shelter using his blanket and some broken wagon wood, creating precious shade in the inferno of the desert afternoon. From his waterskin, he carefully dripped liquid between Elizabeth's cracked lips, watching as she struggled to swallow. Her eyelids fluttered with consciousness, and when she looked at him there was no fear, only desperate gratitude. "You're Apache," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "You should hate me." Eaglefeather's jaw tightened as he continued giving her water. "Hate is a luxury I cannot afford when life hangs in the balance. My husband, he's done terrible things to your people. I know what he's done." Tears began to flow down Elizabeth's sunburned cheeks. "I tried to leave him. I was running away when the wagon broke down. The horses, they bolted in the storm 3 days ago." The warrior studied her face, reading the truth in her pain-filled eyes. This was not the pampered officer's wife he had expected, but a woman who had suffered, who carried shame and sorrow as heavy as the child in her womb. "But you haven't seen the biggest surprise yet." As Eaglefeather tended to Elizabeth's injuries and tried to bring down her fever with wet cloths, she began to speak, haltingly at first, then with growing urgency. She told him about the night raids her husband ordered against peaceful Apache camps, about the scalps he collected and displayed in his office like trophies. She spoke of the children's cries that haunted her dreams and the way Morrison's eyes grew cold and distant whenever she questioned his methods. "I found his journals," Elizabeth whispered, her hand gripping Eaglefeather's arm with surprising strength. "Records of every attack, every innocent person killed. He's planning something worse, a final campaign to eliminate every Apache band in the territory. I was taking the evidence to the territorial governor when—" She gestured weakly at the wreckage around them, then doubled over as a sharp pain shot through her abdomen. Eaglefeather's eyes widened as he recognized the signs: labor pains, weeks too early, brought on by stress and dehydration. "The baby's coming," Elizabeth gasped, terror and determination warring in her voice. "It's too soon, but it's coming." Eaglefeather had assisted at births before. Apache women often gave birth on the trail or in dangerous situations, but this was different. This child carried the blood of his people's greatest enemy, yet it was also innocent of its father's crimes, and the woman bearing it had risked everything to expose the truth about Morrison's brutal campaigns. For the next 6 hours, as the desert night settled around them with its symphony of crickets and distant coyote calls, Eaglefeather became a midwife to his enemy's child. He boiled water over a small fire, tore clean strips from his spare shirt, and spoke softly to Elizabeth as her labor progressed with frightening intensity. "I don't even know your name," Elizabeth panted between contractions, her fingers digging into the sand. "Eaglefeather," he replied, pressing a cool cloth to her forehead. "Son of Chief Standing Bear, guardian of the sacred springs." "Eaglefeather," she repeated, as if testing the name on her tongue. Will you help me save my baby? Even though your husband murdered my sister and her children?" Eaglefeather's voice carried the weight of old grief. "Even though he burned our winter stores and left my people to starve? Yes, because this child is not responsible for its father's sins." Wait, don't miss this crucial detail. As dawn broke over the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Elizabeth Morrison gave birth to a daughter in the arms of an Apache warrior her husband had sworn to kill. The baby emerged small but fighting, her tiny fists waving in protest at being thrust into a world that promised her nothing but conflict and divided loyalties. Eaglefeather cleaned the infant with the gentle precision of a man who understood that life was sacred regardless of its origins. As he placed the baby in Elizabeth's arms, he saw something that made his warrior's heart skip a beat. The child had her mother's blue eyes, but her skin bore the warm bronze tone that spoke of mixed heritage. "She's beautiful," Elizabeth whispered, tears flowing freely as she looked at her daughter. "But James will never accept her. He'll know she's not his." The implications hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Colonel Morrison was a man who valued reputation above all else, who would rather see his wife and child dead than acknowledge a baby who might carry Apache blood. "There's something else," Elizabeth said, her voice growing stronger despite her exhaustion. "I know where Morrison keeps his gold. Payment from cattle ranchers for his protection services. $30,000 in a hidden safe. Money that could help your people survive the winter, maybe even relocate to safer territory. Eagle Feather studied her face, searching for deception, but finding only desperate honesty. Why would you tell me this? Because my daughter deserves to grow up in a world where children aren't murdered for the color of their skin or the blood in their veins. Elizabeth's voice carried a fierce determination that reminded Eagle Feather of Apache mothers defending their young. Because sometimes the only way to stop a monster is to make sure he can't feed his hunger for destruction. The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the morning quiet like gunshots. Eagle Feather's head snapped up, his hand moving instinctively to his knife as dust clouds appeared on the horizon. Multiple riders, moving fast and with purpose, a cavalry patrol, no doubt searching for Morrison's missing wife. "They'll kill you if they find you here," Elizabeth whispered urgently, "and they'll take my baby back to him." Eagle Feather looked at the infant sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, then at the approaching dust clouds that meant discovery and death. In that moment, he made a choice that would define both their futures. What you're seeing now is nothing compared to what happens next. "Can you ride?" Eagle Feather asked, already lifting Elizabeth and her baby with careful efficiency. "I can do whatever it takes to protect her," Elizabeth replied, her voice steady despite her pain. Within minutes, they were mounted on Eagle Feather's horse, the baby secured between them in a makeshift sling crafted from his shirt. As they rode away from the wreckage toward the hidden canyons where his people made their temporary camps, Elizabeth told him about Morrison's plans, detailed maps of Apache territories, schedules for coordinated attacks, even the locations of sacred sites the colonel intended to desecrate to break the spirits of the remaining bands. "I memorized everything," she said, her arms protective around their child. "Every detail, every date, if we can get this information to the right people." "We?" Eagle Feather asked, surprised by the inclusion. "I can't go back to him. Not after what I've seen, what I know. And I won't let my daughter grow up believing that her worth is measured by how well she serves men like her father." Elizabeth's voice carried a steel that reminded Eagle Feather of Apache war mothers. "If you'll have us, if your people will accept us, I want to help fight back." The journey to the Apache camp took 2 days through terrain that would have challenged experienced riders, but Elizabeth proved tougher than her delicate appearance suggested. She never complained about the harsh conditions, the rough sleeping arrangements, or the meager rations Eagle Feather shared with her. Instead, she asked questions about Apache customs, learned words in his language, and told stories to her baby in both English and the few Apache phrases she managed to master. When they finally reached the hidden canyon where Eagle Feather's band had taken refuge, the reception was everything he had expected: suspicion, anger, and demands for explanations. His fellow warriors saw only the enemy's wife and child, symbols of everything they had lost to white expansion and military aggression. But then Elizabeth did something that left everyone speechless. Standing in the center of the Apache camp with her newborn daughter in her arms, Elizabeth Morrison began to speak in broken but determined Apache, words Eagle Feather had taught her during their journey. She told them about her husband's planned attacks, about the locations he intended to strike, about the gold that could fund their resistance or relocation efforts. "I know you have no reason to trust me," she said, switching back to English while Eagle Feather translated. "I know my husband has caused you unspeakable pain. But this baby, your baby too in a way, since Eagle Feather helped bring her into the world, she deserves a chance to grow up free from the hatred that has consumed her father." She knelt in the dust and placed her daughter gently on a blanket, then reached into her bodice and withdrew a folded document, Morrison's detailed battle plans, stolen from his private safe before her escape. "I offer you information that could save your people's lives," she continued, her voice carrying across the silent camp. "I offer you the location of enough gold to buy safe passage to Mexico or Canada. And I offer you my loyalty, if you'll accept it, in the fight against the man who has brought so much suffering to this land." The Apache elders conferred in hushed tones while Elizabeth waited, her hands folded calmly in her lap despite the tension crackling through the air like lightning before a storm. Finally, Chief Standing Bear, Eagle Feather's father, stepped forward. "You would turn against your own kind?" the chief asked through Eagle Feather's translation. Elizabeth lifted her chin with quiet dignity. "I would turn against evil, wherever I find it. My skin may be white, but my heart knows the difference between justice and cruelty. Your son saved my life and my daughter's life when he could have left us to die. I choose to honor that debt." And that's when the most incredible transformation began. Over the following months, as Elizabeth's daughter grew strong and healthy in the mountain air, the young mother proved herself in ways that gradually won over even the most skeptical members of the Apache band. She learned to cure hides, to identify medicinal plants, to weave baskets with the intricate patterns that told stories of the people's history. Her hands, once soft with privilege, grew calloused from honest work. More importantly, the intelligence she provided proved accurate and invaluable. 3 separate cavalry attacks were anticipated and avoided, saving dozens of Apache lives. The gold she had promised was recovered in a daring raid that left Morrison's forces understaffed and demoralized. With their new resources, the band was able to establish a more secure camp deeper in the mountains, beyond the reach of regular patrols. Elizabeth's daughter, whom the Apache women named Little Sky for her bright blue eyes, grew up bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable with Apache traditions and the white world her mother had rejected. She became a bridge between worlds, carrying the best of both heritages while rejecting the worst. As for Elizabeth herself, she found something in the Apache community that she had never experienced in white society: respect earned through action rather than birth, worth measured by contribution rather than appearance, and love that transcended the artificial boundaries of race and culture. One evening, as they sat together watching Little Sky play with the other children around the communal fire, Elizabeth turned to Eagle Feather with a question that had been growing in her heart for months. "Do you think she'll ever understand why I chose this life for her instead of the one she was born to?" Eagle Feather watched the little girl laughing as she chased fireflies with her Apache playmates, her mixed heritage evident in features that combined the best of both her bloodlines. "I think she'll understand that you chose love over fear, truth over comfort, justice over convenience. Those are lessons that will serve her well, no matter which world she ultimately chooses to live in." "And us?" Elizabeth asked quietly. "Do you think we chose wisely?" Eagle Feather reached over and took her hand, once pale and soft, now bronzed and strong from mountain living. "I think we chose to believe that some bonds are stronger than the circumstances that create them, that some families are formed not by blood alone, but by shared struggle and mutual respect." As night settled over the hidden canyon and the stars emerged in patterns that told ancient stories of love and survival, Elizabeth Morrison, now known to the Apache as Strong Heart Woman, realized that she had found something her privileged upbringing had never offered: a place where she belonged not because of who she had been born to be, but because of who she had chosen to become. The woman who had been abandoned to die in the desert had become a bridge between worlds, proof that even in the harshest circumstances, love could bloom where hatred had once taken root. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that courage comes in many forms and that family is defined by loyalty rather than blood, then you've found your home. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales of redemption, transformation, and love that transcends every boundary society tries to build. From desert rescues to mountain sanctuaries, every story we tell proves that the strongest bonds are forged not in comfort, but in the crucible of shared struggle and mutual respect. This is where hearts learn that home is not a place, but a choice to stand together against impossible odds. The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the Arizona territory, turning the rocky wasteland into a furnace that claimed the lives of the unprepared and unwary. But on this scorching afternoon in 1878, The heat would be the least dangerous thing stalking the ancient trade routes that carved through the wilderness like scars across the face of the earth. Stone Wolf had been tracking the slave traders for 4 days, following their trail of broken wheels, discarded belongings, and the heartbreaking evidence of human suffering that marked their passage through Apache lands. At 29, he was one of the most feared warriors in Chief Victorio's band, a man whose name was whispered with respect and terror from the Rio Grande to the Colorado River. His tracking skills were legendary, his aim with both rifle and bow was deadly accurate, and his hatred for those who trafficked in human misery burned as hot as the desert sun. But nothing had prepared him for what he discovered at the abandoned trading post known as Devil's Crossroads. The ramshackle buildings squatted in a depression between red rock formations like a festering wound in the landscape. Smoke rose from a dying fire, and the stench of unwashed bodies and human desperation hung in the still air like a curse. 3 men lounged in whatever shade they could find, their faces bearing the cruel marks of those who had long ago abandoned any pretense of decency or mercy. And huddled in a wooden cage barely large enough for a dog, Stone Wolf saw her. The girl couldn't have been more than 16, with tangled auburn hair that had once been beautiful and green eyes that held depths of pain no child should ever know. Her dress was torn and filthy, her feet bare and bleeding, her wrists raw from crude rope bindings. But what struck Stone Wolf most powerfully was her absolute silence. Even as one of the traders poked at her with a stick like she was a caged animal, she made no sound, showed no reaction beyond a slight flinching of her shoulders. "Mute as a stone, that one," laughed Jake Morrison, the leader of this particular band of human scavengers. "Found her in a burned-out homestead near Tucson. Whole family dead, house still smoking. Girl won't say a word, but she's healthy enough. Should fetch a decent price in Mexico." But the most shocking thing was what Stone Wolf overheard as he crept closer to their camp. "Boss, you sure she can't talk?" asked the youngest of the 3 men, a nervous kid who still had some conscience left in his eyes. "Maybe she's just scared." "Maybe if we—" "Don't matter if she can or can't," Morrison snarled, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Silent women are worth their weight in gold south of the border. Less trouble, easier to handle. This one's going to make us rich boys." The 3rd man, a scarred brute called Dutch, kicked at the cage with his boot. "What if she tries to run when we get to the border?" Morrison's laugh was like breaking glass. "Where's she going to run to? Girl's got no family, no home, no voice to call for help. She's perfect merchandise, broken in just enough to be manageable, but still young enough to be valuable." Stone Wolf's hand moved instinctively to his knife as rage flooded through him like molten metal. These men spoke of the girl as if she were livestock, a commodity to be bought and sold without regard for her humanity or suffering. In Apache culture, women were honored and protected, their voices heard and respected in tribal councils. The idea of treating any woman, especially a child, as property was an abomination that demanded justice. But as he watched the girl's hollow, defeated expression, Stone Wolf realized that rescuing her would be only the beginning of a much longer and more difficult journey. And that's when everything changed forever. As the 3 slavers settled down for their afternoon rest, confident in their isolation and the profit their captive would bring, Stone Wolf began to move. He had learned the art of silent killing from his grandfather, a war chief who had fought both Mexican soldiers and American cavalry with equal skill and hatred. Every step was calculated, every breath controlled, every movement as fluid and deadly as a striking rattlesnake. The first man died without ever knowing death had come for him. Stone Wolf's knife slid between his ribs like silk, finding his heart with the precision of a surgeon and the finality of a judge. The second man managed to open his mouth to scream before the Apache's hand clamped over it, and the blade opened his throat in one swift, merciful cut. Morrison, the leader, was awake and reaching for his gun when Stone Wolf emerged from the shadows like an avenging spirit. The slaver's eyes went wide with terror as he recognized the war paint and traditional weapons of an Apache warrior, but his hand never reached his holster. Stone Wolf's tomahawk split his skull with a sound like a melon hitting stone, ending his career in human misery with the same brutality he had shown his victims. The silence that followed was profound and absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through the rocks and the distant cry of a circling hawk. Stone Wolf cleaned his weapons methodically, then turned his attention to the cage where the girl huddled, her green eyes wide with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. "I am not here to hurt you," Stone Wolf said softly in English, kneeling beside the wooden bars so he wouldn't tower over her in a threatening manner. "These men will never harm anyone again." The girl stared at him for a long moment, her gaze moving from his painted face to the bodies of her captors, then back to his eyes. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, shaking her head in frustration and pointing to her throat. Stone Wolf nodded his understanding. "You cannot speak. That is all right. Words are not always necessary between people who understand suffering." He produced his knife and began working on the crude lock that held her cage shut, his movements careful and deliberate so she wouldn't be frightened by the blade. As the lock fell away and the cage door swung open, the girl remained motionless for several heartbeats, as if she couldn't quite believe her imprisonment was truly over. But you haven't seen the biggest surprise yet. When Stone Wolf extended his hand to help her from the cage, the girl suddenly threw herself forward and wrapped her arms around his neck, her body shaking with silent sobs that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. He could feel the bird-like fragility of her frame, the way her ribs showed through her torn dress, the desperate hunger for human kindness that radiated from her like heat from a dying fire. "Easy, little sister," Stone Wolf murmured, using the Apache term for a young woman who deserved protection and respect. "You are safe now. No one will put you in a cage again." As he held the trembling girl, Stone Wolf noticed something that made his warrior's heart skip a beat. Around her neck, hidden beneath the collar of her tattered dress, hung a small silver cross, but it was engraved with symbols that were unmistakably Apache, sacred signs that marked her as someone who had been touched by his people's medicine, someone who carried a connection to the spirit world that transcended the boundaries of blood and birth. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just any settler's daughter rescued from slavers. This was a girl who bore the marks of Apache blessing, someone who had been claimed by his people's magic in ways he was only beginning to understand. "Where did you get this?" Stone Wolf asked gently, touching the cross with one finger. The girl's eyes filled with tears as she pointed to herself, then made a series of gestures that told a story more powerful than words. She had been taken in by Apache people as a small child, raised among them, blessed by their medicine men, given their protection and love. The burned homestead where the slavers found her hadn't been her birth family's home. It had been the refuge where Apache friends had hidden her from soldiers and bounty hunters who would have killed her for her association with hostiles. Stone Wolf felt his world shift like sand in a windstorm. This girl wasn't just an innocent victim he had rescued. She was one of his own people, lost and found again in the most unlikely circumstances. Wait, don't miss this crucial detail. As Stone Wolf helped the girl to her feet and began gathering supplies from the slavers' camp, she suddenly grabbed his arm and pointed urgently toward the horizon. Her green eyes were wide with fear as she gestured frantically at something only she had seen or heard. Stone Wolf followed her gaze and felt his blood run cold. A dust cloud was approaching from the east, multiple riders moving fast through the desert heat, more slavers, or perhaps cavalry soldiers drawn by reports of Apache activity in the area. Either way, they needed to leave immediately. But as he lifted the girl onto his horse and swung up behind her, she did something that stopped his heart cold. She turned in the saddle, looked directly into his eyes, and spoke her first words in what he sensed had been months or even years of silence. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice as soft and broken as wind through autumn leaves. "I remember you." Stone Wolf's hands tightened on the reins as the full meaning of her words hit him like a physical blow. She remembered him. But from where? When? He searched his memory frantically as they rode away from the trading post, trying to place those distinctive green eyes, that auburn hair, that face that seemed familiar despite the suffering that had aged it beyond its years. And then, like sunrise breaking over the mountains, the memory came flooding back. 3 years ago, during one of the worst winters in Apache memory, his band had found a wagon train trapped in a blizzard near the Mexican border. Most of the travelers were already dead from cold and starvation, but among the wreckage they had discovered a young girl, barely alive, clutching the frozen body of an Apache woman who had apparently been traveling with the settlers as a guide and translator. The woman had been Stone Wolf's cousin, Maria, who had married a white man against her family's wishes and lived for several years in the world beyond the reservation. As she lay dying in the snow, she had pressed something into the girl's hands, the silver cross with Apache symbols that now hung around her neck, and whispered something that only the girl had heard. Stone Wolf's band had taken the girl in, nursed her back to health, given her a place among them during the hardest months of winter. She had learned their language, participated in their ceremonies, even received a blessing name from the medicine man. But when spring came, and the soldiers began their renewed campaigns against Apache bands, it had become too dangerous to keep a white girl in their camp. She had been secretly relocated to the homestead of friendly Apache families who lived peacefully on the edges of white settlement. And now she was here, in his arms again, saved once more from those who would use her innocence for profit and cruelty. What you're seeing now is nothing compared to what happens next. The journey back to Stone Wolf's hidden canyon stronghold took 3 days through some of the most treacherous terrain in the Southwest. But during those long hours in the saddle, with the girl's slight form pressed against his chest for warmth and protection, something remarkable began to happen. Slowly, haltingly, her voice began to return. It started with single words: water when she was thirsty, tired when they needed to rest, beautiful when they crested a ridge and saw the sunset, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. But as her confidence grew and her fear began to fade, the words came easier, flowing like water returning to a drought-stricken stream bed. She told him her name was Grace, not the Apache name the medicine man had given her, but the white name she had been born with before tragedy and chance had made her part of 2 worlds. She spoke of the terror of being caged like an animal, of the degradation and hopelessness that had driven her voice so deep inside herself that she had begun to believe it was gone forever. But she also spoke of the dreams that had sustained her through the darkest hours, dreams of riding through endless desert under starry skies, of sitting around Apache fires listening to the ancient stories, of a warrior with kind eyes who had once promised her that she would always have a place among his people. "I never forgot your face," Grace whispered on their second night as they shared dried meat and water beside a small fire hidden in a grove of ancient cottonwoods. "Even when I couldn't remember my own name, I remembered you. I knew someday you would come for me." Stone Wolf studied her face in the firelight, seeing not just the traumatized girl he had rescued, but the young woman she was becoming. Someone who carried the strength of both worlds, who had survived horrors that would have broken weaker spirits, who possessed a beauty that came not from physical features, but from an unquenchable inner light. "You saved yourself," he said quietly. "I only opened the cage. Your spirit was never truly captured." When they finally reached the hidden canyon where Stone Wolf's band had made their temporary camp, the reception was everything he had expected: surprise, suspicion, and guarded curiosity about the white girl who spoke Apache and wore their sacred symbols. But Grace handled the scrutiny with a dignity that impressed even the most skeptical elders. She approached Chief Victoria with the proper respect, offering the traditional greetings she had learned during her previous stay among the people. When the old medicine man examined the cross around her neck and pronounced it genuine, blessed by authentic power, the mood of the camp shifted from suspicion to acceptance. But it was Grace's reunion with Stone Wolf's grandmother, an ancient woman named Desert Rose, that convinced everyone of her legitimate place among them. And that's when the most incredible transformation began. The old woman took one look at Grace and burst into tears, pulling the girl into a fierce embrace that spoke of old grief finally finding resolution. In rapid Apache, she explained to the gathered crowd that this was the child she had mourned for 3 years, the young woman she had prayed to see again before she joined her ancestors in the spirit world. "I taught her to weave," Desert Rose declared, her weathered hands stroking Grace's auburn hair. "I showed her the patterns that tell our people's stories. I gave her the name Singing Bird because even when she could not speak our language, her heart sang with Apache rhythms." Over the following weeks, as autumn settled over the high desert and the band prepared for the challenges of another winter, Grace proved herself in ways that gradually won over even the most doubtful warriors. She worked alongside the women, contributing her skills in healing, cooking, and crafts. She helped care for the children, teaching them English words that might help them survive in an increasingly white-dominated world. Most importantly, she used her unique position as someone who understood both cultures to serve as an interpreter and mediator, helping the band navigate the complex political landscape that threatened their survival with each passing season. Stonewolf watched all of this with growing admiration and something deeper, a feeling that went beyond gratitude or protective instinct into territory that made his warrior's heart beat faster and his dreams more vivid. Grace was no longer the terrified child he had rescued from slavers, but a woman of remarkable strength and wisdom who had found her voice and her place in the world. One evening, as they sat together watching the stars emerge over the canyon walls, Grace spoke the words that would change both their lives forever. "I want to stay," she said simply, "not as a refugee or a guest, but as one of the people. I want to make my life here, with you, if you'll have me." Stonewolf turned to look at her, seeing in her green eyes the same determination that had helped her survive captivity and find her voice again. "You understand what that means? The dangers, the hardships, the uncertainty of our future." Grace smiled, the first truly joyful expression he had seen on her face since the day he found her in that cage. "I understand that home isn't a place or a people you're born to. It's where you choose to plant your heart and let it grow." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that was both innocent and profound. "You saved my life, Stonewolf. Now let me share it with you." The woman who had lost her voice to trauma and terror had found it again in the most unexpected place, and in doing so had discovered not just her own strength, but a love that transcended every boundary society had tried to build between them. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that sometimes the greatest courage comes from learning to speak again after the world has tried to silence you, then you found your home. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales of resilience, redemption, and love that grows strongest in the soil of shared struggle and mutual respect. From desert rescues to canyon sanctuaries, every story we tell proves that the human spirit cannot be caged, no matter how dark the circumstances. This is where voices lost are found again, and where hearts learn to sing in harmony despite the chaos of the world around them. The autumn wind swept across the dusty trading post like a harbinger of change, carrying whispers of desperation and broken dreams. In the makeshift auction square, where human dignity went to die under the merciless New Mexico sun, a crowd of rough men had gathered for what they called Damaged Goods Day. But none of them could have predicted what Cale Windwalker was about to do, something that would shatter their world and change 2 lives forever. Sarah Coleman sat in the back of a weathered wagon, her slender fingers wrapped around a small wooden bird her late mother had carved. 3 years had passed since the fever took her sight, leaving her in a world of endless darkness where she learned to navigate by sound, smell, and the cruel intentions of those around her. The rough voices of bidders surrounded her like vultures circling carrion, each word a reminder of how far she had fallen from the daughter of a respected schoolteacher to property being sold by a stepfather, drowning in gambling debts. "Gentlemen, what we have here is a rare opportunity," called out Bill Henderson, her stepfather, his voice thick with desperation disguised as salesmanship. "She's 22 years old, healthy as a horse despite the blindness, and trained in all the domestic arts, can cook, clean, sew, and she's quiet as a church mouse, never talks back, never complains. Hell, she might even be grateful for a man's attention after being alone so long. The assembled crowd erupted in coarse laughter that made Sarah's skin crawl. She had learned to read the subtle differences in men's voices, the ones who laughed with cruel amusement, the ones who chuckled with dark intent, and the ones whose silence spoke of even worse things. These men saw her not as a person, but as an object, a problem to be solved with enough coin. From his position on the rocky outcropping above the trading post, Kyle Windwalker observed the scene with growing disgust. At 28, the Apache warrior had seen enough of white man civilization to understand its capacity for casual cruelty, but this spectacle of human trafficking disguised as legal commerce made his blood run cold. The girl in the wagon carried herself with a dignity that her circumstances couldn't diminish, her spine straight despite her fear, her chin lifted despite her blindness. His Apache name, Kyle Windwalker, had been earned during a vision quest when he was 16, after he had walked alone through a 3-day sandstorm and emerged with the wisdom that sometimes the greatest strength came from bending with the wind rather than fighting it. But today, he would not bend. Today, he would stand firm against an injustice that offended every value his grandmother had taught him about protecting the vulnerable. But the most shocking thing was what happened when the highest bidder made his move. Clayton Morrison stepped forward from the crowd, his massive frame casting a shadow across the auction platform. Known throughout the territory as a rancher with a taste for violence and a history of wives who mysteriously disappeared, Morrison dropped a heavy leather pouch on the makeshift table with the confidence of a man who expected to get what he wanted. $200, Morrison announced, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone accustomed to owning people. I'll take the blind girl off your hands, Henderson. Got a ranch that needs tending, and a woman who can't run away or cause trouble sounds perfect for my needs. Sarah's breath caught in her throat like a trapped bird desperate for freedom. Even in her world of darkness, Morrison's reputation had reached her ears through the whispered warnings of women in town. His first wife had allegedly died in a fall from their barn loft. His second wife had vanished during a harsh winter, leaving behind only blood-stained clothes that Morrison claimed belonged to a butchered deer. Please, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the desert wind. I'll work harder. I'll do anything you ask. Just, please don't. Shut your mouth, girl, Henderson snapped, his eyes gleaming with the prospect of escaping his debts. You're sold to Mr. Morrison here, and you'll be grateful for it. A blind woman has no business being choosy about her circumstances. Kyle's hand moved instinctively to the knife at his belt, its bone handle worn smooth by generations of warriors who had wielded it in defense of the innocent. He had made a sacred vow to his dying father, Chief Standing Bear, that he would honor the ancient ways, protecting those who could not protect themselves, speaking for those who had no voice, standing against injustice regardless of the personal cost. And that's when everything changed forever. The warrior descended from the rocks like a shadow given substance, his moccasins making no sound on the hard-packed earth as he approached the crowd. Every step was calculated, precise, carrying the fluid grace of a predator who had learned to move through hostile territory without detection. His long black hair was adorned with eagle feathers that marked his status as a war chief's son, and the intricate beadwork on his buckskin shirt told the story of battles fought and victories won in defense of his people. When Cale spoke, his voice carried the authority of thunder rolling across vast plains and the quiet menace of a mountain lion defending its territory. The woman is not for sale. Every head in the crowd turned toward the voice like compass needles finding true north. Morrison's hand dropped instinctively to the gun at his hip, but something in the Apache's stance, perfectly balanced, ready for violence but not seeking it, made him hesitate. This was not some desperate brave looking for trouble or glory. This was a warrior who had seen real combat and emerged victorious, who carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove and everything worth defending. You got no business here, Apache, Morrison snarled, though his voice carried less confidence than his words suggested. This is a legal transaction between civilized folks. Move along before you find yourself dancing at the end of a rope. Kyle's dark eyes never wavered from Morrison's face, reading the man's intentions like tracks in fresh snow. Around his neck hung a necklace of bear claws and turquoise that marked him as descended from chiefs, and his arms showed the lean muscle of a man who had survived by strength, skill, and unwavering determination. "She chooses her own path," Kyle said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel that made several onlookers unconsciously step backward. "Not you. Not him." He nodded toward Henderson. "Her." Sarah turned her head toward the sound of his voice, confusion and desperate hope warring on her face like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. In 3 years of blindness, no one had ever suggested she might have a choice in anything. Her world had become a series of commands and limitations, of being told what she could and couldn't do. Who are you?" she asked, her voice stronger than it had been all morning, as if the simple possibility of choice had breathed life back into her spirit. Kyle stepped closer, his movements careful and non-threatening, designed to calm rather than intimidate. "Someone who believes a person's worth isn't measured by what they cannot see, but by the strength of their spirit, burning bright enough to light the darkest night." Henderson stepped forward, his face purple with rage and greedy panic. "Now you listen here, savage. I got legal papers on this girl, guardianship signed by a territorial judge. She's mine to do with as I please until I say otherwise, and I say she's sold to Mr. Morrison here." Kyle's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes like heat lightning on a distant horizon. Papers written by men who think they can own other human beings. Your law says slavery ended with your war, yet here you stand, selling a woman like cattle in an open market. But you haven't seen the biggest surprise yet. Without warning, Morrison lunged for his gun, his hand clearing leather with the practiced speed of a man who had drawn on others and lived to boast about it. But Cale moved like lightning itself, his reflexes honed by years of hunting and warfare where a moment's hesitation meant death. Before Morrison's weapon could rise more than inches from its holster, the Apache's blade was at his throat, its razor edge drawing a thin line of blood. "I wouldn't complete that thought," Kyle said quietly, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who had killed before and would do so again without hesitation if necessary. "I've ended the lives of men for far less than what you plan to do to her." Morrison froze like a deer caught in a hunter's sight, feeling the cold steel against his skin and seeing his own death reflected in the Apache's dark eyes. Around them, the other men stepped back, their hands moving carefully away from their weapons as they realized they were witnessing something beyond their understanding or control. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring ready to snap. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried its lonely call, as if nature itself was bearing witness to this moment of reckoning. "Anyone else want to place a bid on a human being?" Kyle asked the stunned crowd, his voice carrying across the desert like a challenge thrown at the feet of God himself. Silence fell like a stone into still water. Sarah found her voice, and when she spoke, it carried a strength that surprised everyone present, including herself. I choose to go with him." The words hung in the superheated air like a prayer and a declaration of war combined. For the first time in 3 years of darkness and despair, Sarah Coleman had made a choice about her own life. Kyle slowly removed his blade from Morrison's throat, but his eyes never left the rancher's face. "You heard her speak her will freely given. The choice is made, and it will be honored." Morrison's face twisted with rage and humiliation. "This ain't over, Apache. That girl's marked for death out here in the wilderness. And so are you. The territorial government don't take kindly to Indians stealing white women." Kyle turned toward Sarah, extending his hand palm upward in the universal gesture of offering help without demanding acceptance. "Can you ride a horse, Sarah Coleman?" She nodded quickly, then hesitated. "But I can't see the stirrups or judge the horse's temperament or know which way we're heading once we start moving. I'll be your eyes, he said simply, his voice carrying a gentleness that seemed at odds with the deadly warrior who had just faced down armed men. If you'll trust me to guide you safely. Wait, don't miss this crucial detail. As Cale helped Sarah onto his magnificent paint stallion, a horse that had carried him through countless battles and across endless miles of frontier wilderness, Morrison struggled to his feet, wiping blood from his throat. The humiliation of being bested by an Apache in front of other white men burned in his chest like acid. "You think you're some kind of hero, Apache?" Morrison spat, his voice thick with hatred and wounded pride. "That girl's worth less than the horse you're stealing her on. She's damaged goods, useless baggage that'll slow you down and get you both killed before the week is out." Kyle settled Sarah in front of him on the saddle, his strong arms creating a protective circle around her trembling form while maintaining a respectful distance. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her back, the careful way he adjusted his position to ensure her comfort and security before considering his own needs. "Then you clearly don't understand how to recognize what's truly valuable in this world," Kyle replied, his voice carrying a quiet dignity that made Morrison's crude words seem even more petty and small by comparison. As they rode away from the auction site at an easy pace that wouldn't jar or frighten his passenger, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since before the fever took her sight: genuine safety. The steady rhythm of the horse's gait, the warmth of Cale's chest against her back, the way he quietly warned her of low-hanging branches or sudden changes in terrain, all of it spoke of a consideration she had never known existed. Behind them, Henderson's voice rose in fury, carried on the desert wind. "She'll be nothing but trouble, Savage. You'll see. That girl's cursed, marked by God himself for suffering and sorrow." But his words were quickly lost in the vastness of the high desert, swallowed by wind and distance, and the sound of hoofbeats carrying two souls toward an uncertain but infinitely more hopeful future. "Why?" Sarah asked as the trading post disappeared behind them, and the sun climbed higher in a sky she could no longer see but could feel warming her face like a benediction. "Why did you help me? You don't even know me, and your people have every reason to hate mine for what we've done to you." Kyle was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief and hard-won wisdom. "My sister was born with a withered arm," he said simply. "She was the most beautiful person I ever knew, and she saw more beauty in this harsh world than anyone with perfect sight and perfect limbs. She taught me that what others call weakness is often just a different kind of strength waiting to be recognized." His voice caught slightly, and Sarah felt his chest tighten with remembered pain. "When the soldiers came to force our people onto the reservation, I couldn't save her. The long march in winter, the disease that followed, it took her, along with so many others who deserved better. But today I could save you, and maybe that's enough to honor her memory." Sarah felt tears she hadn't shed in months begin to fall. "No one has ever cared about what I wanted before," she whispered. "I was just a problem to be solved, a burden to be passed along to whoever would take me off someone else's hands." "Everyone deserves the right to choose their own path," Kyle said, his voice firm but gentle. "My sister taught me that being different doesn't make someone broken. It makes them see the world in ways others cannot. And sometimes that different vision is exactly what the world needs most. What you're seeing now is nothing compared to what happens next." As they made camp that first night under a canopy of desert stars, Kyle moved around their small fire with quiet efficiency. But unlike other men Sarah had known, he narrated his actions, describing where he was placing their supplies, what sounds meant what, painting verbal pictures of the landscape around them so she would never feel lost or helpless. "The fire is about 6 feet to your left," he explained as he arranged their simple camp. "I've spread a blanket here for you to sit on, and there's a flat rock behind you if you want something to lean against. Our horses are picketed about 20 feet to your right, and there's a small creek just beyond them where I filled our water skins." Sarah had never heard the world described so vividly through words alone. Kyle painted pictures with language, the way flames danced against the velvet darkness, the colors that streaked the sky as the sun disappeared behind distant mesas, the silhouettes of ancient cacti standing like sentinels against the star-filled heavens. "My sister taught me to see with words," he explained softly, his voice carrying the warmth of cherished memory. "She said the world was twice as beautiful when you painted it with language for someone who couldn't see it with their eyes." For 3 days, they traveled deeper into Apache territory, moving through landscape that grew more rugged and beautiful with each mile. Sarah's other senses, already sharpened by years of blindness, seemed to grow even more acute in the clear desert air. She could smell rain coming from 50 miles away, could tell by the echo of their horses' hooves what kind of terrain they were crossing. On the morning of the 4th day, Sarah's supernatural hearing picked up something that made her blood run cold, the distant sound of multiple horses moving fast through the desert, their hoofbeats creating a rhythm that spoke of deliberate pursuit rather than casual travel. "They're coming," she whispered urgently, her head turning toward sounds still too distant for Cale to detect clearly. Multiple riders, at least 5 or 6, pushing their horses hard through the heat. "They've been following our trail since before dawn." Kyle's respect for her abilities had grown with each passing hour. He had already learned that her blindness had sharpened her other senses to levels that seemed almost mystical. She could identify different types of rock formations by the way sound echoed off them, could sense the emotional state of animals by subtle changes in their breathing. The confrontation came with the sudden violence of a summer thunderstorm. Morrison rode into the narrow canyon where they had taken shelter, leading a posse of 5 hard-faced men whose intentions were written in the weapons they carried and the rope coiled on Morrison's saddle horn. "Come out, Apache!" Morrison's voice echoed off the canyon walls like the roar of an angry god. "You got something that belongs to me, and I aim to collect it, along with your scalp for the trouble you've caused me." Kyle stepped out from behind the red rocks that had concealed their position, his rifle ready but not yet aimed, offering his enemies one final chance to choose wisdom over violence. "The only thing here that belongs to anyone is her freely given choice to live as she sees fit. Honor that choice, and ride away in peace." Morrison's laughter rang harsh and bitter off the canyon walls. "Honor? From a savage who steals white women and corrupts them with heathen ways? The only honor here comes from the barrel of a gun and the justice of a rope around your neck." The battle erupted with explosive violence that echoed through the canyon like thunder trapped between stone walls. When the gun smoke finally cleared and the echoes of violence faded into desert silence, 3 of Morrison's men lay dead among the red rocks. Morrison himself had taken a bullet through the shoulder, but remained alive, though barely conscious. The 2 surviving members of his posse had fled. Kyle knelt beside Sarah, crimson seeping from a graze along his left shoulder where a bullet had come close enough to tear his shirt and burn his skin. "Are they gone?" Sarah asked, her hands immediately moving to examine his injuries with gentle precision. "I can help you," she said, her voice calm and competent despite the violence that had just ended around them. "My mother was a healer and midwife before she died. She taught me everything she knew about treating wounds and fighting infection with natural remedies. And you won't believe what happened next." As Sarah tended to Cale's wounds with skill that would have impressed a trained physician, her hands moving with the confidence of someone who had learned to navigate the world entirely through touch, he began to understand something profound about the woman fate had brought into his life. This person, whom others dismissed as damaged goods, possessed capabilities that went far beyond what any of them could imagine. Her touch was sure and gentle as she cleaned his wounds with water from their precious supply. She directed him to gather specific plants from the canyon floor, medicinal herbs she identified purely by their scent and texture, plants that would prevent infection and accelerate healing when properly prepared. "How do you know all this?" Kyle asked quietly, watching her work with growing amazement and profound respect. Sarah smiled for the first time since he had known her, a real smile that transformed her entire face. "When you lose one sense, the others don't just become stronger, they become partners in survival. But more than that, When you've lived in darkness, you learn to find light in knowledge, in skill, in being useful to others when they need you most. As she worked, binding his wounds with strips torn from her own petticoat, she told him about her mother's teachings, the healing properties of different desert plants, how to read a fever through touch alone, the subtle signs that indicated whether a wound would heal cleanly or develop infection. 6 months later, in a hidden canyon where Kyle's band had found temporary refuge from increasing military pressure, Sarah had become something no one could have predicted when they first saw her trembling in that auction wagon, their healer, their teacher, their bridge between the old world and the new, and the beating heart of a community learning to survive against impossible odds. The Apache women, initially suspicious of this blind white woman their war chief's son had brought among them, gradually came to recognize her extraordinary gifts. She could diagnose illnesses by scent and touch that their traditional healers missed, could locate internal injuries that showed no external signs, and could treat conditions with a combination of her mother's knowledge and their ancestral wisdom. More than her healing abilities, Sarah had become their teacher and cultural ambassador. She learned their language with astonishing speed, her acute hearing allowing her to master subtle pronunciations that escaped others. In return, she taught the children English and basic arithmetic, skills that might help them navigate an increasingly complex world. Kyle often watched her moving through their camp with the confidence of someone completely at home in her environment, her laughter ringing across the canyon as children gathered around her for stories that blended Apache legends with tales from her own childhood. The woman who had once been offered for sale like livestock had become the center around which dozens of lives revolved. One evening, as they sat together beside the communal fire, listening to the night sounds of the desert coming alive around them, Sarah spoke the question that had been weighing on both their minds. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Taking me away from that auction, bringing danger to your people, making yourself a target for men like Morrison who won't stop hunting us?" Kyle considered her question with the seriousness it deserved. "Do you regret choosing to come with me instead of accepting the life they had planned for you?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "When I was sitting in that wagon, listening to those men discuss my value like a piece of livestock, I thought about dying," she admitted. "I thought about how easy it would be to just stop fighting, stop trying to survive in a world that had decided I was worthless." She reached out in the darkness and found his hand with unerring accuracy. "But then you appeared and gave me something I had never possessed before. Choice. Not just the choice to leave that place, but the choice to discover who I could become when I wasn't being told constantly what I couldn't do." "You saved me too," Kyle said, his fingers intertwining with hers. "I was becoming bitter, angry at a world that seemed determined to destroy everything I loved, ready to fight and die just for the sake of fighting. You reminded me what we're truly fighting for, not just survival, but the right to live with dignity, to choose our own paths, to protect what's beautiful and worth preserving in this world. The woman the world had tried to sell had become the one who saved them all. If this story of courage and unexpected love moved your heart, if it reminded you that even in the harshest circumstances, human dignity and connection can triumph over cruelty and despair, then you've found your home. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales of redemption, resilience, and romance that defies every boundary society tries to build. From dusty trails to whispered promises under starlit skies, every story we tell reminds us that true strength often emerges from the most unexpected places. This is where the frontier-tested souls and hearts discovered what it truly means to find home.